Hello, everybody, and welcome to Littlefield live streaming. Tonight's show is Science Fictions with GB Kim. And now, please welcome GB.
Hi, hello. I'm thrilled to have you all here in my kitchen. So we're gonna walk around the elephant in the room, but I do hope you all have the means to cope as best as you can. I know a lot of places and a lot of folks need help, and community gem Littlefield is definitely one of them. So please, if you can, donate to them. So a couple ground rules that I'm going to set out. This is being recorded, so keep in mind your privacy needs. I will be using adult language, so keep that in mind for any children present. The Q&A will be at the end, and it will be fielded by folks at Littlefield, and hopefully I will have answers for you. Art is inherently political, so we will be venturing into political spaces, and I'm pretty damn political. For our purposes, acting politically correct is acting with respect and care. The rise of what folks might feel is too much policing, I actually think is those that have been historically marginalized gaining enough power to express what we feel is hurtful or painful. So as much as I would like this to, host this live event as a safe space, I just want you to be aware that it's a public space. And so, I will attempt to the best of my abilities to facilitate safe conduct, but be aware that it's public. Take care of yourselves and your needs as best as you can, and try to be mindful of the people that are here with us. So this format is definitely unusual. I find it lends itself to some of my preferences in representing my work. I'm perpetually concerned with releasing my work, I guess, like into the wild, not in like a Tiger King kind of way, but just in a book monster sort of way. That's what Mary Shelley called Frankenstein. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to illuminate as much as I can some of the representations I've made. So to walk you through what's going to happen, I'll initially show you two sets of work, 8 works total, 4 pieces in each. Then we'll move to talking about the narrative behind the original title of the show, the show that was supposed to be in person, and then I'll go into the 2 sets of works themselves. And then towards the end, we'll do a deep dive of the concepts that are related to these pieces. But in the interest of starting off in full disclosure mode, I think that exhibiting work is undoubtedly a very privileged and sometimes wasteful process. It costs an unbelievable amount of money to frame work, and thank you to all the folks that helped me do that. And while, of course, framing is an architectural craft and a way to protect the work, and honestly, very high quality beautification, framing itself, I want to keep in mind, is designed to kind of signal value, dare I say, virtue and authority. So not just in how well an art object is framed, but also that it is officially art, an economic object that is worth being bought and sold. And then, of course, exhibiting capital E itself is a whole other ball of performative intelligentsia worms, which is a story for another time. I thought this was worth mentioning because I've struggled to kind of reconcile this privilege with the work itself, which is conceptually opposed to established ideas of scientific and artistic authority. So, I take comfort that maybe when we all perish in some future extinction event, that future creatures will find my still perfectly framed work and use it as sparkly nesting material. So we'll start with the 8 works. Here we go. And there'll be some DIY moving around here. By the way, I'm not speaking during this portion. I don't know if I made that clear. I'm apologize for any confusion. Still kind of figuring it out. This is the start of the second set. All right, so those were the 8, and I'll return to them as we keep going. Let me just reset up here for speaking mode and not showing mode. So that was the 2 pieces that were pulled from the overall show, which was called, there are 2 sets that were pulled from Cyborg Multivalence, Prophylactic Exorcisms. So don't flip the channel. Cyborg generally means an individual that is part human, and part mechanical. And it's a contraction of cybernetic organism. Here I use cyborg in light of Donna Haraway's essay, Cyborg Manifesto. She has been really important to me. This work has been really important to me because my work deals with possibilities of symbiotic relationships, and that's all of her work. Actually, that's probably really reductive. But Cyborg Manifesto, in my view, kind of shows how future survival of our species is predicated on our relationships with the technological creations and the things that we make, essentially. So cyborg is used here both literally and figuratively. So if you think of like a pacemaker or an organ transplant, a prosthetic limb, and then even different medicines that you take on a regular basis. And then also figuratively, even in the platform that we're using now, the relationships that we have to our digital materials. And so the argument is that we need to understand that everything we create is an extension of ourselves, and therefore our responsibility, because it's us and not outside of us or other to us. That our technology is only a reflection of our culture and where we are as a society. So that also means that it's a reflection of the things that we are terrible at. So that includes any type of systemic type of oppression that's built in. We make our technology, so our technology reflects who we are. And that, we would need to stop thinking about it as Skynet versus humanity for a survivable relationship. So Cyborg Manifesto argues that the synthesis is possible, that human, machine, and animal integration is not only necessary for survival, but also politically productive. Cyborg is used here then to represent this idea of multiplicity of an individual, and then the collective creation accountability throughout space-time. Multivalence is, in medicine, multivalence refers to an antigen or antibody, probably words you're more familiar now with during this pandemic, but essentially that the antigen or antibody has multiple docking sites. So I use it here in an additional meaning to the term ambivalent, which means, to be pulled in two opposing directions. So multivalence here meaning being pulled in multiple directions, or being multi-capable and multi-purpose. Prophylactic exorcisms. Prophylactic is used here exactly as it is defined. So preventative treatment in anticipation of a future illness, ailment. And exorcism is about the expulsion of my historicity ghosts, which I'll go into later. It is an act that's about kind of looking backwards and forwards in time to exercise the shit that is and will be problematic. The trick, of course, being, how do I know the things that I'm carrying with me into the future? So the two series that I've shown here, the initial four, the bluer set, the other works couldn't make it into the kitchen. They couldn't fit in the kitchen, but these two sets actually complement each other, and they explore possible futures that may or may not include humans, while also critically inspecting the ways in which Eurocentric science has historically authorized itself to explore and objectify what it views as the natural world. So in a second look at one of the pieces with Alter, I'll hold it with me and talk about it at the same time. I don't know how this is, this is very an interesting format we're looking at. So hopefully you can't really see the screen. Okay, so title of the first set, all the roots of the titles begin with alter, and so that term is from Latin, and it means other. So these are other organisms or organisms other to us. The alter grouping, I gotta stop saying the alter grouping is meant to be specimen imaging. I replicated the image making to reflect kind of the first atlases that deconstructed and described the natural world. So for if you're having kind of trouble deciding what exactly I mean by atlases, this is kind of like a pretty classic image you would see, right? Like it doesn't have a background, it doesn't have context. It's just an object, or an organism with its stages of life, and then its genus and species written out underneath it. So, these were images that sought to kind of order the world, but instead represented the gaze of the natural historian or scientist. So the natural world eventually came to mean the world that was other to the white European men observing it. So the gaze, and you can see how the gaze is exported all over the world as a dominant aesthetic style and a way of understanding information. So even if you go to like a natural history museum, you can tell that what they consider natural history does not ever include white Europeans. So alter is a kind of study of imaging specimens while trying to deal with this problematic tradition of naming and classifying that which we view as other. Taking a look at so this is the last image from the second set, and its root title is Aliyah. And so Aliyah, let's see how close I can get that. Aliyah means by another way, also Latin. And so that choice is also deliberate to use something that was used by natural historians to give themselves like more authority, or using like a classical language to give it a certain type of meaning about academia and education. So the Aliyah grouping is also meant to be a specimen imaging. They are the cephaloid or head region parts of these Aliyah creatures or organisms, and it is an expansion on alter, but imaging something more within our projected timeline. So organisms that are altered by anthropogenic, so anthropogenic meaning originating in human activity, altered by anthropogenic biogenetics and technology. And in order to kind of look at the conceptual core of the work, I'm going to do a deep dive of two terms that I was focused on. The first is historicity. So for clarification, philosophical historicity is simply the idea that we as individuals arrive to our present, all that we are, as a direct and indirect result of all of our history, or everything that precedes us, right? And so this can be really focal, or it can be more about a larger community. So it could be like an individual moves through a web of both seen and unseen interactions. And I think of these influences kind of as ghosts in simultaneous time. So simultaneous time is like Dr. Manhattan. You live your past, your present, and your future all at the same time. Everything is now. And if I could kind of give the concept of historicity a shape, it would probably be a solid cylinder expanding like forwards and backwards. Direction doesn't matter to the cylinder, it matters to us, but that would be the shape, and it might be moving and then spinning, and that warps the time. But also, this is not part of any type of math. This is just something that I used as a tool to kind of help me think about it. So I consider my own historicity as tangled up with the culture of science. My mother and father both established their educations in America through science. Even my brother studies chemical engineering. He's almost finished. All your stereotype dreams come true. We're like a STEM Asian American family, which I will kind of speak to in a moment, right? They came to the US for myriad reasons. My father wanted to cure AIDS. My mother came, I believe, for the higher education standards and also maybe to be a landscaper. And their parents lived through various parts of the Korean War and maybe had for reasons of how the Korean War played out, hopeful beliefs about American life. Looking back, I think about how our mobility and privileges in the world were contingent on the experiences and professions of my parents. So I realized that what I have is a seat at the table. So to have a seat at the table means to have access to dominant systems. This is also referred to as the master's house. I have a responsibility in looking at this to kind of change the culture of science and to acknowledge my historicity and incorporate this into my work. And the second term that I was kind of looking at is future time, which is kind of a silly term, but the future was not descriptive enough. So this is a rumination or imaging, imagining of the Anthropocene future and a consideration of the historicity ghosts that we might be bringing with us. So I think some of my historicity includes things like honorary whiteness as a model minority. So what is that? So that's like I like performing your immigrant like bootstrapping task well, right? That you become a model minority so that people can point to you and say, or like dominant cultures can point to you and say, they were able to do it, like why can't you? Usually that is used to kind of speak about or like brush away problems of inequity, specifically with like American racism. So that strong intergenerational fighting power is another thing that I bring with me. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. Science as my home and childhood, and then science also as the truth, and science as imperialism. And also like a bit of the destructive power of the American dream. And in this thinking about future time, you know, it's a question of like, are we even included in the future space time? So when I was making these pieces, I kept getting my mentor, Pato, kept asking like, where do they live? When do they live? And it was very hard to, I didn't want to pin that answer down because I didn't know if we would be there or if it would just not, maybe not just us as we are now. And honestly, hopefully not as we are now, as I think we could probably improve as a species. And you know, maybe it isn't the future at all. Maybe it's something parallel or existence that's not necessarily related to time. And I also had a lot of anxiety about things. I didn't want these future time representations to be. So not apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic. So why do we need things that are not apocalyptic? I think that from reading a lot of Donna Haraway and then Ursula Gwyn, who's a science fiction writer, that we have a lot of representations of dystopian places, post-apocalyptic places, kind of worlds where we've failed to maybe do the things that we set out to do, and that those examples outnumber examples of kind of more successful futures, or I don't exactly know what success means in that context, but that if you continue to put out more aesthetic representations of the same thing over and over, you kind of limit the alternate projections that we can see for ourselves. It's harder to see futures that are non-apocalyptic when you keep getting representations. And this idea is, it's burdens of representation. That's really what that term is about. So like, you don't want to create an allegory. You want to create like multiple different versions. And I didn't want it to be about ultra war future or ultra money future like Altered Carbon or something. And I didn't want it to be fear mongering in terms of, I didn't want us to think about having opposition to something that we didn't necessarily need to have opposition to. So that again is bringing back Donna Haraway's thoughts around the coexistence, the symbiosis, that you can be more politically productive if you synthesize yourselves. And I also didn't want it to be puppies and rainbows. So the altar images are made to look like fitted shells. Let's see if I'll have at least a part of that up. So they're, based on the bone structures of marine organisms to signify evolved reactions to, they're also based on bone structures of marine organisms to kind of signify evolutionary historicity. In terms of future time, Alter was looking at evolved reactions to danger, so colors associated with self-protection, drawn from poisonous or toxic organisms on Earth. So projected evolution, like what are the exorcisms an organism goes through to be a part of the future time or for us now. With the second set, with Alia, as I mentioned, the images look at possibilities more affected by what we recognize in our timeline as biogenetics and technology. So it's kind of a look at the historicity of human genetic and technological invention and intervention. And can I actually have, my partner is helping me. Let's look at the last.
The last.
Yes, that one. Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you. So another thing I was thinking about with Alia is they're layered in such a way where I didn't want it to be completely distinct which was in front and which was in back. And so that was kind of collapsing time, visually collapsing time, which, and I was thinking about ways that we alert each other to information, particularly at night, specifically neon signage. So I think culturally we accept neon light strips, tubes, signage as synthetic, especially as a visual cue. Bright lighting in general serves to augment our vision, going beyond our mammalian diurnal capabilities and extending our active hours. So it's kind of a relationship that we have to changing our environment and our environment changing us. And I think that that's the whole syllabus. You made it. We can spend more time with the work through, if it comes up in questions, we can keep spending time on it. But I am ready to start Q&A. So let's go for it. Here we go. And there's the Q&A option, I believe, in YouTube. I think you can also use the comment section, and we're gonna give it like a few more minutes. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about the titles. So the titles for each of the images, I didn't really bring up specifically because they are devised a bit mathematically, but just to give a general sense of how I built out the titles without too much math involved. They were contractions of statements that had to do with biomimicry, different textile uses, different types of evolved proteins for stopping fish from freezing. It's called an ISP protein, or that's redundant. It's just an IS protein. And so all these names for Alia, that was the second set, came from trying to think about interventions we might make to ourselves or to other organisms. Okay, there is a question. Yeah?
What? Jeff asked me a question.
How has the COVID-19 era influenced your more recent work? Okay. So these works were made prior to, that's pretty obvious, I assume. I think that I focus a lot on what the new Pangea is. That's a weird answer. So to give some context to that, there's this, when Pangea was like a single continent that was on the Earth, and then they broke apart, plate tectonics, and now we have different continents. But the idea of new Pangea is that we connect all the land together by anthropogenic movement, right? So flights, trains, boats, cars, that you pick up something in one land and you bring it somewhere else. And so this has been true. This has been, why the bats are dying off, why frogs are dying off. And the pandemic, I mean, aside from having what you can probably tell is a really anxious personality that focuses most of its energy on planning for the future, COVID-19 is still pretty surreal. Like, I don't know that I can make production out of it, but I would say that it makes me rethink about, how quickly work needs to be effective. I've always felt like it's not enough. I don't know what artist doesn't feel like it's not enough, but yes, that I hope that is it's very difficult to do Q&A when I can't see people. So from Stephen, the first set, which I immediately saw as part of a crab or crustacean evolving and perhaps being negatively affected by human involvement in the world. Is there a particular reason you chose a crustacean as opposed to, let's say, the barrier reef or any other type of marine life, such as fish or whales, etc.? There is not necessarily a particular reason. I chose the textures based on general exoskeletal structures, or like very common uses of, so chitin is one. It's a turtle beaks. They're also used, they're not used, sorry. ticks are made out of chitin. And I think that I would have probably explored something closer to what we might recognize as larger mammals, but I, again, didn't want to reference Earth too much. Like, I didn't want it to be too much of a reflection of this place, this time space. Okay, so can you speak to set 2, piece 3? Representation of particular anatomy. Yes. Okay. So all the pieces from Alia are based around what I know to be facial structures, but really fragmented, really, I don't think fractal is the right word for it, but it's the latter 4 pieces, I think, are also a bit more cosmetic feeling. They don't have as much of a sense that there was a creature, but things that maybe were adorned because they're from our timeline. Yeah. So no silly questions. Okay, from Tiffany. I am curious about the scale of your work. Is it a reference to the scientific drawings you talked about? Would love to see them giant. Okay. So large scale work is something I've been dying to do. It's mainly because of environmental factors. Like, we live in New York. I can't necessarily, I've done really large work, and the other kind of part of the original show were pieces that were about 7 feet by 6 feet on average and about 5 feet high. And, it was grotesquely expensive to prepare those pieces to be shown or be seen. But murals are always an option. I have to keep that in mind. So from Eliana, you mentioned Donna Haraway and her idea that a future world might see a synthesis of animal, human, machine beings. Do you think this being is actually possible? If so, what do you think the artist's responsibility is to represent these future beings? So I really hesitate to, so I as I said, the 3 aspects of historicity that I have that are attached to science is science as my childhood and home, science as the truth, and then science as a force of imperialism. And I oscillate between the 3. And I feel like the one that keeps kind of paying for me in terms of, is this actually possible, is science as the truth. I don't know. I know that if we can, we probably will. I don't know about the ethics of genetic modification and the ethics of augmenting have a larger conversation around it. I think that the way that it's possible is probably psychologically more so. And that's really difficult, right? To try to view yourself as not necessarily being a discrete individual, but part and blended with many different things that are not necessarily what you identify as yourself. I think that the responsibility that artists have in terms of representing futures where so if we look at something like Star Trek, right? All the beings depicted are to some extent humanoid. And I think that with a film, let's say like Arrival, or actually the book, the story of your life, they do an excellent job of asking us to question what we consider seeing, what we consider top, bottom, past, now, body, language. All those things are culturally invented ideas. So I think that the artist's responsibility is being aware that there should be doubt. I hope that answers that question. It probably does not, but we can expand on that at another time. So from Michelle, can you speak a little to or describe the pieces you were not able to show today? You mentioned there were pieces that didn't fit in your kitchen. Okay. So they were images that I had made in my senior thesis at Parsons. And I was in the illustration department, and I think that it was a strange thing to be in a space and in a community that was trying to be figurative, because it was illustration. And I made these large abstract pieces that were just ink over large sheets of watercolor and with spaces cut out of them. And I haven't been able to look at that piece for a very long time. And so Prophylactic Exorcisms was also talking a little bit about taking work that I couldn't deal with, couldn't look at, and excising the things out of it that I didn't know what to do with, and then relayering them. So they were transparent, kind of cut out patterns. And so all those pieces, there were 5, were about trying to imagine an environment of future time, which is very difficult. And I have been very reticent to create backgrounds for that reason. But it was an abstract depiction of kind of textures. And then the piece was also about decision making and choices, that the decisions that we make and the choices that we make have repercussions, and that we have responsibilities. But maybe that's kind of real deep. It's not that deep. From Stephen. I thought that the second set resembled the human heart in shape, sometimes in color. Was that ever an intention of yours? I think you said earlier that it was meant to be a face type shape. So yes, it was supposed to kind of be built around the head. And when I was working on it, I was taking images of just a face and then kind of generically superimposing structures over it, and then layering those and then removing things away and just kind of having front back blurring. But I mean, I think that the work that I've made always looks like many things. In some ways, they're landscapes, a description of a surface, right? So I think that that kind of lends itself to being like, it looks like this, or it looks like a map, or it looks like land. And yeah, I mean, the face could look like a heart. It has holes in it. That's, yes, yeah. From Tiffany, have you considered breaking away from paper? Your work seems to be better suited to sculpture. So when the altar set was being made, the mentor that I had asked me, ideally, what would you be building? And I explained to them that ideally I would be building something that was quote unquote life size. So a freestanding sculpture that I made that was just all of these different forms that I had created. And we kind of created things out of paper, created things out of wax. And when I think about the surface and the sculptural surface of the work, I feel like the material is some type of like silicone plastic. It's the only thing I can think of that I know that I can reference, but those are not sustainable materials. And so, and then, the irony of framing it, but the lack, I would have to kind of make the textile and know a bit about it. And there's still a future conversation to be had where I kind of use the materials to tell the story of the irony of it not being sustainable. My mentor phrased it much better than that, but that I would love to move to sculpture. That's what I originally started in before I became a painter. Question about your process. Can you tell us about your literal artistic process, how you made each piece, e.g., what mediums you used, how you created the intricate layers, also how long does it take you, I'm sorry, questions are coming in. How long does it take you to do one of these? So first I stew for a long time. Probably given the academic dense lecture that I was essentially like hiding behind with the work, that I do all of that beforehand, mental stewing and all the planning. And then I kind of think about, I don't know, like the practical ways of executing it, right? Like who doesn't do that? And then the materials that I use watercolor paper for the most part. And I use ink. I don't use watercolor. I've used watercolor, I enjoy it, but ink has a lot of punch and a lot of density. And I actually use fountain pen ink because it has a lot of sediment in it and it has a lot of separation when you add water. So I use ink, I use acrylic as a barrier for the water. So it becomes kind of its own gutter or landscape to kind of limit the edge of the water. And sorry, how you made each piece? So the cutting out process, that actually began as a solution to a mistake that I made. I didn't like the mistake I made, so I cut out the portion and then I just kept backing it. And it just appeals to me. It feels much more, I think it deals with wanting to do sculpture and it being a flat medium. And how long does it take? From start to finish, like concept to finish, if I only work on that, about a week. So, but then there's all the laborious, like, am I doing it? Am I not doing it? Yeah. Oh, from Pacho, what do you think might happen if the forms became 3D, or would they lose the abstraction that is happening with the 2D works on the paper? So this kind of gets into the weeds of things I'm personally scared to do as an artist. One of them is accidentally killing an image. And so that can happen. So that's metaphorical, obviously. But kind of killing an idea or killing a thing that I haven't really pinned down what its actual form is. I think that I'm scared to kill it by naming it. There's a very distinct power to naming something that kind of diminishes all the possibilities and probabilities that it could fill. And then I think they would lose abstraction, but I feel like 3D has such a way of shaping negative space that you could probably retain a lot of it. But in a more literal sense, if I were to make sculptures of it, because it becomes more defined, there will be more, it looks like this, or it looks like that. And I don't necessarily not want that to happen, but it can sometimes influence. I don't know. I'm very worried about killing future time paths. I don't know if anyone watches Steven Universe, but like how Garnet can see multiple different time paths. I'm very afraid to tamp in or close doors, or I could just not want to pull the trigger or something. From Troy, what's next in the iteration of these concepts? So I think it will go on for a while. Alter and Alia are separated by about 2.5 years. And because, I mean, I can talk about my work in sets, but in reality, the whole thing is connected. And so, I have a lot of tattoos, and I feel like it's a similar kind of story where they're not discrete events necessarily. For me, this is speaking for myself. So they're not necessarily discrete events, like they're all part of one storyline. And so, yes, this series will definitely expand. There is a new project that I've been working on in tandem for about 3 years, and it's kind of, I forced myself to do something that I really didn't want to do, which was to be extremely figurative, to see how scary it would be and to see what would come out of it. And I am not ready to show that work yet, but it's definitely, I keep getting asked like, where, what, like who, and when. And I feel like maybe I'm doing a disservice by being so abstract that I'm trying to see if I can flesh out a bit of a larger narrative at some point, one that's more distinctive, and maybe in that way a more descriptive, and then hopefully more productive. That's very hard to say. From Rhea, where does your color inspiration come from? Is it in relation to an element you are incorporating into a piece, such as the shell or chitin? I'm drawn to the first set, love the use of complementary colors. Thank you. So I actually was really, when I first started out painting with ink, I was terrified of leaving monochrome. But I got really invested in trying to create images that were a little bit harder to look at, like literally harder to look at, where I was kind of hoping for an effect where you would look at it and it would kind of burn out your retinas, and then you look away and there'd be kind of an imprint image. And so I want the images to be really contrasted. And then, just a secret is that I personally love that color of turquoise. So that's like my favorite, like a gem depth turquoise. And then the only thing that is, complementary to that is like a red orange, like a fire red orange. So, and then also, I think that, with the history of natural histories, maybe due to the nature of what it is, due to the nature of how things are reproduced, what was available for printing presses, but it still has an effect on the way that we view the information. Natural histories feel very natural tones, like very muted things, and whether that's an artifact of time or whether that's an artifact of its making, it, as a child, like I didn't think I understood that the natural world actually possesses, like most creatures that are not people, have way brighter colors. That it's kind of also about pushing away familiarity too. Like the more strange the color is, maybe we can push familiarity away a little bit more. So from Collins, how was your time at Parsons and inspired you as an artist? Oh, so Parsons is, when I attended, I don't know that I knew what I wanted. And I think that's fair for a lot of undergraduate experiences, but I really struggled to find kind of crossover between work. And they had programs like IDC, I think it was like integrative design, something. But I was really kind of hoping for a lot more political science, repercussions for the things that we do. Why should we continue to be artists in a world like this? And there are nice answers, like because you bring beauty to the world, or because like art can be truth. And it didn't ever feel like enough to me. And I would say that going to NYU actually ended up, I got like a very large support group there. And the program I went to was called Arts and Public Policy. And so I was really able to kind of use the experience at Parsons to get really good technical training, very, very good technical training, and actually a really good education in art history, which then helped me to connect the art history to science history, because the two are actually tied together. It's actually the history of objectivity is the history of art and science together. And then, okay, so the last question is, when do we have the privilege of holding and reading your book, A Space in Print to Sit with Your Work, Thinking, and Embodiments? Oh my God, it's coming. Like, I keep picking up and dropping different formats for the work, and I think I find this to be a personal character flaw of mine, that I want people to read an entire dissertation paper before I show them my work. I think it's because I'm scared to let the work do something terrible. But yes, a book format would be ideal. And I'll say that it will be in 2 years. I'll set a deadline. So I think I can take 2 more questions, and then I want to close it out with some thank yous. But yeah, I'll take 2 more here. From Avram, you talked about how names have power and consequences. Do you come up with paintings names first or after you make pieces? Can you tell us 1 or 2 of the names of a piece and explain them? Okay. So I name them after. I always know what the words, the lexical glossary around the work is going to be like, but I don't title them until I look at them after as finished images. So okay, maybe can I have the last one of the with the, it's number 4 and with the blobs. Maybe that's the most descriptive way to say it. It's the one that you haven't shown me. Is it? So I'll say, okay, so before, yes, yeah. The name for this one is Alia biosim underscore VF lux operon to the third power. So what that means is they're all structured in this way of like, there's Alia, and then the second part of the name is describing like in what context is the alteration, right? So for this one, it's a biosymbiont. It's a symbiotic organism with whatever creature this future time creature organism is. And so the biosymbiont that I chose is Vibrio fischeri, so VF, right? Vibrio fischeri are bacteria that bioluminesce, and they actually have a symbiotic relationship with bobtail squid. And the protein that makes them, the gene that makes them bioluminesce is called lux operon, light, the operon of light. And then to the third power is like the dimensional, so like the layers of it, and so the dimensions that it has. And so I figured that I would, if I express that, people might fall asleep a little bit. And in terms of how names have power and consequences, so I like to think of the naming process for a lot of my work as really clinical, like super non-necessarily, it's like really descriptive, but it's also not like emotionally descriptive, because I'm very worried about the biases that I put into the words that I use, right? So for example, a term like this was like a whole debate question that I remember being a part of, but so the term like sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East or like the East, right? That those words are being given as it tells you more about the person who named it than it does about the region itself, because it doesn't fucking matter if you're in Iran, like you are not the Middle East, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. The way that we name things like positions them, in a certain proximity to us. And that doesn't just go for obviously geographic things, but that was just an example. So and then so from Ben, do you let the concepts form before the aesthetic or vice versa? Ooh. I would say that I have always drawn in a particular way. I guess it's a style. It's just the way that my hand wants to draw things. Like at the very tip of something, that it kind of has like a little hinge and then it comes back. So, but in terms of like, I'm assuming like color and design, the concept definitely comes before the image, if that is kind of what that is asking. I'm really stuck inside concept. I'm just a dusty old academic. And then, okay, so the very last question is from Anne. Your language in your presentation prior to Q&A was very compressed. How much or little do you verbalize your work before and during making it? Okay, so I definitely struggle to describe my work in a way that makes any kind of English sense. Not that I would make more sense in a different language. English is my first language. But I verbalize my work by talking about the concept. I don't necessarily talk about like, oh, like what about the shape, or if I arrange it like this, that I don't know that that's something that people want to help me with, and it's also not something I feel like is a common ground moment. So the thing that is, and I also prefer to talk to people that are not necessarily, I love artists, but I prefer to talk to people that are not necessarily artists to talk through a concept, so I know where my biases are coming in, or where I'm not giving enough attention, or not able to do something. So that is kind of, in that sense, like I verbalize concept first, and then I probably only talk about if I do talk about the work itself, it's in emotions of, it feels like this, or I wanted it to be about this, this like feeling, or I wanted it to be about this concept. Like clearly it was like very hard for me to describe. I mean, let's say elevator pitch style, all the work is about the space-time continuum, or the lack of, right? Like fourth dimensional world, I guess. That is a very collapsed and condensed version of it, but I feel like it's pointing at it like right on. And I feel like that's a moment that I kind of previously described, where I feel like it kind of kills it. That could just be me, though, not wanting to be explicit and always trying to be like very evasive. So yeah, to close, I want to thank you guys for watching, those who came to watch. Huge thanks to Julie Kim. She like made this whole shit happen. Thanks to, and all the folks at Littlefield that are still doing their work, even though like this is a challenging position. And thanks to my mentors and guides for helping me time travel. Pato, Miles, Jack, Leora, Cheryl, Kathy, KMA, James, Ellie, Kimon, Crystal, Saina, Sophia, Nikki, Chloe, and Ben, my folks, and my lovely assistant, Paul. And I've provided resources for anyone interested, and also some financial resources too. The application windows for some of them are closing, so just take a quick look through them just to look at the deadlines, but there's about 6 of them there that were also compiled by folks at NYU. So, and thank you so much. Good night.